Hello. I'm going to take a few minutes now to discuss how to read about literature. As I've said before, we can greatly expand our enjoyment of literature by not just experiencing it directly, but also by reading about it. This kind of reading might differ from the other kinds of reading we do. Thus, we can help ourselves as readers of literature by considering how we can do that. Well, first, of course, we must actually read a work of literature. And by this I mean any specific work of literature. We need examples to think about general cases. So if we want to think about critical theory, we need to read works of literature. And of course, if we want to think about a specific work of literature, we can start by first reading that work. When we do this, we give ourselves a chance to develop ideas about what we have read. We can use our training as readers, along with our non-literary experience, to find meanings in a work of literature. And we can do this thinking on our own, using what we already know and what we bring to a work of literature. And then, once we have some ideas of our own about the work we're thinking of, we can find helpful sources for more ideas about that work. Of course, the question arises about how we know when we've found the right source. We can think about this in a couple of ways, starting with what we know about how writing works. We can usually get a hint from how a critic starts to write about a work as to how helpful a source will be to the point we want to make about that work. Especially in the case of critical essays, we can generally find an opinion toward the critique's beginning. Let's remember the kind of paragraph structure that we studied in earlier English classes. Most critics have studied writing in that way also, and so they will have the habit of starting their essays or paragraphs even with a main point. We can determine whether a source will be helpful or not by looking at that main point and thinking about the critic's idea. In fact, we want to look specifically for ideas we can use to make our own points about the work of literature that we want to discuss. We can agree or disagree with what a critic says. In fact, we can use our disagreement with a critic's ideas to highlight our own ideas. We can say that a critic reads a work in some particular way, but we don't see what that critic sees. Instead, we see something else, and that allows us to express our own ideas about a work of literature. Thus, as we read more carefully, we can also write more accurately about what we see in a work. In other words, we help ourselves greatly when we engage with our sources. Our engagement, our attention to what a critic says, and our attention to how we respond to what that critic says, helps us continue the conversation that a work of literature inspires. As we decide how much we agree or disagree with the critiques we read, we take part in a discussion covering potentially hundreds of years or thousands of miles. Indeed, the idea of discussion helps us most when we read about literature. Our initial ideas react and respond to the ideas of other critics to create new ways to understand works. When we read about literature, we allow ourselves to enter this discussion. And when we think of ourselves in discussion with other critics, we think most usefully and most deeply about literature. Thus, when we think about how to read about literature, we think about not just what we see a critic saying, but also about what we want to say to the critic. The work of literature lives within us as it lives within other critics, and when we read about literature, we give ourselves a chance to experience that life from another perspective. The best way to do this is by our engagement and by our participation in that great discussion. As always, thank you for your time and attention.